All right, folks, it's time to pop the champagne because Democrats cleaned up in yesterday's elections, seizing critical, high-profile victories in some states which seemed, at first glance, to be unlikely. But before we unpack all that, if you haven't yet, please hit that like, subscribe, and the alert bell. All right, folks, there's no need to beat around the bush. Yesterday was a success for Democrats, for democracy, and an absolute abject humiliation for the Republican Party. I write about this on Luke Beasley's website, lukebeasleyshow.com/news. And the article is GOP's losing streak persists in last night's critical elections, which basically gives you everything you need to know. There were several high-profile victories for the Democratic Party. I want to just give you a brief overview of them. First, Kentucky. So Kentucky is one of the reddest states in the country. It has a Republican supermajority in its legislature, and the incumbent Democratic governor won re-election, Andy Beshear. What's interesting, though, is he was up against a Republican challenger who was kind of a political golem, Daniel Cameron, who was simultaneously, just imagine this, the protege of Mitch McConnell, Kentucky's most infamous politician, the sinister eldritch abomination of the U.S. Senate. Okay, he had that going for him, to whatever extent that's a benefit. And then he was also a fervent supporter of Donald Trump, who, by the way, repeatedly, publicly endorsed Cameron. So he was basically, politically, he was the beneficiary of two different strains of Republican extremism, and yet he was unable to oust Andy Beshear, who won re-election. Phenomenal news. Then you have Virginia. Okay, so Virginia's governor is Glenn Youngkin, a Republican, and Youngkin is kind of a political celebrity among Republicans. As a matter of fact, many political commentators were saying, listen, if Trump's too controversial, if DeSantis is too controversial, maybe Glenn Youngkin could be like the Gavin Newsom of the right and kind of slide in, like a lot of people are hoping or expecting that Gavin Newsom will do in the Democratic primary, and kind of save the election for Republicans. Youngkin went around the state of Virginia, spending a lot of time, effort, energy, and money trying to hype up support so that he could get control of the Virginia legislature to enact a far-right agenda. The Virginia legislature is bicameral, has two chambers. It has a Senate and a House of Delegates. Democrats controlled the Senate, but Republicans controlled the House of Delegates. So if Republicans won yesterday, that would have given Glenn Youngkin a subordinate legislature, right? And he would have been able to pass all kinds of ridiculous legislation. Not only did Democrats keep the Senate, they flipped the House of Delegates. So Glenn Youngkin has now hit a double brick wall against a Democratic legislature, both chambers. Incredibly huge. But there's more than that. Then we go to Ohio, which has, I believe, a Republican, Republicans at least control one part of Ohio's legislature. They have a Republican governor as well, Governor DeWine. And there were two ballot measures on. So this wasn't really about specific candidates, but about two specific ballot measures, essentially referenda, right? They were voting on specific issues. And the two issues in question were abortion and marijuana. So as of a result of yesterday's election, there is a constitutional right in the Ohio Constitution, as of yesterday, a constitutional right to have an abortion in Ohio. And recreational marijuana use for people 21 and older in Ohio is now legal. Democrats won on abortion, they won on marijuana. And the Republican legislature's leader, I think his name is Jason Stevens, he's salty about it. He's like, this is not the end of the conversation, he tweeted out. But this is huge. This is another major victory. And then the last one, I would argue, is still important, not quite as memorable as the other two. But in the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, there was a vacancy. There's supposed to be 7 seats on the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. One was vacant. Democrats won that vacancy. So now Democrats in the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court have a super majority, 5 to 2. Folks, this is huge. It's absolutely huge. Now, actually, I do want to add this one part. The biggest high-profile defeat for Democrats of the evening, and it was a long shot anyway, was in Mississippi because the incumbent Republican governor, Tate Reeves, won re-election. But I do want to point something very interesting out. Republicans talk about stolen elections and things like that. Note this. Hinds County, which is the most populous county, the most populous district in Mississippi and majority black controlled, were continuously running out of ballots. It's been widely reported on. one precinct after another, just running out of ballots, running out of ballots, running out of ballots, with dozens or hundreds of people still waiting in line to vote. So just very curious, okay? I wonder if there will be any sort of investigations or pushback from Democrats in the Mississippi legislature on this. We have no idea, but just put a little asterisk behind this. But not exactly surprising that a Republican incumbent in Mississippi won re-election. So I'm not saying it would have made a difference, but this, I imagine, will be an ongoing story because I imagine Democrats are going to have some things to say about it. And speaking with Democrats who have things to say on yesterday's elections, President Biden, he said across the country tonight, democracy won and MAGA lost. Voters vote, polls don't. Now let's go win next year. Now, of course, he's referring to the devastating recent polling, which we've talked about on this channel. And by the way, as a sidebar, aggregate polling did predict, for the most part, yesterday's election results. Aggregate polling did predict that Andy Beshear had an advantage in Kentucky, that the ballot measures in Ohio about both abortion and marijuana were likely to pass, and that Youngkin would at least fail to flip the entire legislature in Virginia. So for the most part, yesterday's results were commensurate with the polling. I just want to put that out there. It's important to know that. But this is good news, right? Because as we discussed in previous videos, in special elections this year, there were at least 30. Democrats overperformed in 24, and that was before yesterday's election results. So off-year elections have been good, and midterm elections have been good for Democrats. And this may energize the party as we head into 2024, which is about a year out. But President Biden wasn't the only one to comment on it. You had Majority Leader Chuck Schumer of the U.S. Senate. He gave remarks earlier today.
There is no possible takeaway from last night other than this. Americans fiercely oppose MAGA extremism, fiercely oppose total abortion bans, and want bipartisan leaders who can put America's needs first. After last night's results, I have a message to my Republican colleagues. When the MAGA agenda can't win in deep red Kentucky or in Ohio or help you in Virginia, it's time to recognize MAGA extremism is the wrong answer, not just for the country, but even for the GOP. I hope Republicans in Congress see that after last night, extremism must be rejected and bipartisanship embraced.
So, respectfully, Senator Schumer, it's a beautiful sentiment, but the Republican Party has repeatedly proven that they're not particularly introspective, and they're too much of a death cult of personality, I think, to escape Donald Trump, even though, as Schumer points out, they certainly should. As a matter of fact, this is what a former Republican politician and current conservative commentator on Newsmax, Rick Santorum, this is what he had to say when discussing yesterday's election results, and note the difference.
And you put very sexy things like abortion and marijuana on the ballot, and a lot of young people come out and vote. It was a secret sauce for disaster in Ohio. I don't know what they were thinking, but that's why I thank goodness that most of the states in this country don't allow you to put everything on the ballot, because pure democracies are not the way to run a country.
So there you have it. No introspection really whatsoever. Their first instinct is just to demean democracy, to condemn democracy, to disparage democracy when democracy yields results that they don't like. See, this is the thing. We talked about this. The Republican Party is convinced, top to bottom, that they can't win elections if you maximize eligible voter turnout, if you leave things based on popularity. Now, the funny thing is that may very well be a self-fulfilling prophecy, because I would argue, given the Republican Party's history, given the fact that they won the popular vote in 2022, like more people voted Republican in 2022 than Democrat, if they would just moderate their rhetoric, if they would moderate their policies, if they would pick sane, palatable candidates, I still think that Republicans would be hella competitive in highly Democratic, I mean small d Democratic, like highly, like elections in which eligible voter turnout were maximized. I don't think that Republicans would lose every election, and I think they would remain highly competitive. But they don't even want to consider it. They want to do anything and everything in their power to just go the path of least resistance, to shore up their institutional advantages, so that all they have to do is appeal to a certain critical minority vote, a minority of voters, and still win elections. That's what they want to do. But regardless, yesterday was a resounding success for the Democratic Party and for democracy, and an abject humiliation for the Republican Party and the modern conservative movement. So bask in their suffering, delight in our victory, and let me know what you think in the comments.